Welcome everybody that's just joining. I see a bunch of people coming in. I appreciate your attendance. We're going to give it just a few minutes and we'll go ahead and get started a couple minutes after 2 p.m. Hey, welcome everybody who's just joining. I really appreciate your all's attendance, and we're going to go ahead and get started in just a few more minutes as people continue to shuffle in. Give it about 2 more minutes. All right, it's 2:02. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this virtual webinar. It's February 3rd, 2022, and we've titled this webinar, What's New 22? And this is part of our approximately quarterly TACCSTER webinar series. So TACCSTER is our TACC symposium for Texas researchers, where we try to highlight interesting research projects going on around Texas, people who are using TACC resources. But today with this webinar, we're actually going to try to go in a slightly different direction. We have a lot of new machines, new services at TACC, and based on some recent funding allocations that have gone through, we're opening up some things to Texas researchers more broadly. So what we wanted to do with this is take about 10 to 15 minutes each. And 3 of us are going to talk really briefly about 3 new systems we have at TACC, 3 new and updated systems we have at TACC that are earmarked for Texas users. And joining me today, I have two of my esteemed colleagues. We have Nick Thorne, who is in the large scale systems group at TACC. And I also have with me Chris Jordan, who's from the data intensive computing group. And they'll do a better job introducing themselves because I know I'll butcher it. So I'm going to let them each introduce themselves a little bit and then talk about 10 to 15 minutes about a different machine. And so I'll have Nick go first. He's going to tell you about Lone Star 6. And then Chris Jordan will talk a little bit about Corel, the newest iteration of Corel. And then I'll come back at the end and I'll talk a little bit about Longhorn. And if anybody has any questions for any of us at any time, this is, it's super informal. Just go ahead and unmute or raise your hand or type it in chat. We can ask questions as we go or save them to the end, whatever you prefer. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. I'll let Nick share and I'll let him take it away.
Hi, good afternoon all. As Joe mentioned, my name is Nick Thorne. I'm a large-scale systems group manager at TACC. So I'm responsible for a team of just short of 10 system administrators, and we manage some of the National Science Foundation funded flagship systems, but then also 6 or 7 other systems and subsystems that are in the case of the one I'm going to discuss today, Lone Star 6, funded through other funding sources. Our team is responsible for a pretty wide variety of systems and subsystems. So Lone Star 6 as a cluster is funded by Texas institutions. A selection of the Texas university systems all contribute into the system. And we have some very long-term partners like the Center for Space Research, which always puts in some money to the Lone Star series of computers. And as you gather from the numeral, we're on the 6th iteration of the system. I worked on Lone Star 5 as well, and there is a bit of background detail that I'll mention as I go through things. But Lone Star 5 was sort of forcibly retired in, May last year, I believe. And Lone Star 6 is the replacement, and it's taken us a little bit of a while to get it going. I'm not particularly good with slides. I prefer to mostly just talk, but some of these are going to be pretty bland, especially after this one. But just going through what we've actually put together over the last couple of months. This is a photograph of our machine room. It was not taken by any kind of professional photographer. And it's pretty hard to get all of the system in. So I'm going to go over some of the items. We've got a rack sitting in the back left corner over here, which is sort of management and administration. And then fairly importantly, the core switching infrastructure is sitting in the lower half of this rack. It doesn't really light up very nicely. And then the next 2 racks moving along over here are all the parallel file system that was selected. So TACC has got a long history of doing Lustre file systems. In this case, we actually went with a Lustre competitor called BGFS. It is all supported on Dell hardware. I'm going to go into details on a lot of the hardware that supports each of these subsystems in the next few slides. So this is just to kind of give you an overview of the layout and our machine room. And then I'm unsure if I'm actually blocking. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay, that's excellent. Zoom. The Zoom overlay is not visible to you as far as I'm aware. Then we've got a selection of air-cooled racks. So these are 3 of them over here. And there are 10 in total. So the others span out across the far left-hand side of the data center. So this image doesn't actually even capture the entire system. And then these are composed of Dell R6525s, which are just 1U dual socket servers, individual servers. And then further down, right in the bottom of the rack, there are 4 R7525s. These are also dual socket servers and nearly identical, but they are 2U servers, meaning that we can host additional cards and more specifically GPUs. And again, I'll go into the hardware details in a little bit. But then, as you can see, sort of front and center are 4 tanks, each containing 21 C6525 chassis. Each 6525 chassis is essentially made up of 4 quarter U servers. So they're a 2U chassis with 4 servers in each. These are submerged in a mineral oil cooling system, and in the side of this tank are the heat exchangers for moving the mineral oil, which is being warmed by the servers, and heat exchanging it with the cold water loops that exist underneath the floor of the data center. So the reason I sort of put this up, other than that, you know, it's a pretty good way to just kind of show the amount of construction going on, is to demonstrate the split between the air-cooled hardware and the mineral oil-cooled hardware. There were quite a few complex design decisions in terms of getting the cooling infrastructure right for supporting the amount of hardware that we wanted to in this specific area of the data center. So I said I'd bring up Lone Star 5 again. Well, where these tanks actually are located is where Lone Star 5 was before we removed it. And it was a Cray system, and Cray are pretty famous for creating very good density of servers in an air-cooled environment. The way they do this is they control a lot of the airflow, and they use essentially the equivalent of in-row coolers. You can see we've got a pair of in-row coolers in the background over here. Trust you can see, yes, you can see that. So we're using similar technologies to what the Cray did in the air-cooled environment. But in terms of getting the density of hardware up as high as possible, there are some pretty serious design constraints, and Cray do this extremely well. But one of the competing technologies that we've been investigating for quite a long time and has been pretty successful for us is this mineral oil, or they call it immersion cooling. So you're literally immersing the servers in a coolant fluid. It makes it pretty unpleasant to work with as system administrators. All our repairs are done on this little trolley over here, which is, you know, specially kitted out with absorbent towels, and we try to keep things as clean as possible. But it is an upward, you know, a substantial challenge in terms of keeping things repaired. We have actually also noticed, and this is purely, I don't have the right word on me at the moment. This is just our opinion at the moment. We don't have any hard data backing this up. We have heard similar things from other people also running this, that we actually get a slightly lower component failure rate by the with the immersion cooled servers over the air cooled servers. It's not concrete yet, but we suspect that that's the case. In the background of this image, you can actually see a couple of cranes mounted to the top of the machine room ceiling. That is for 4 other mineral oil tanks. They are related to one of our flagship systems, Frontera. So we have a fair selection of this technology, and we've essentially deployed more of it as time has gone on. And the specific reason, and there were actually talks in the early stages of Lone Star 6 planning of putting all of it in mineral oil, rather than sort of, well, I would say 70%. So I'll get into server counts in a second on the next slide. Unfortunately, they're going to get a little worse than this. But this was one of the constraints we were dealing with, simply because the Cray created a great density and cold water to air chilled solution for this particular corner of the machine room. But for us to go purely air cooled in this corner of the machine room would have been fairly challenging and probably more expensive than what we were hoping for, simply because the large air conditioning units that create the cold air cushion under the floor of the machine room are essentially about as far away from this corner of the machine room as they can possibly be. So we would have been installing many, many more of these in-row coolers. We may have had to go with a solution like actively cooled rack doors. And for a system of this size, approximately 500 nodes, that's not really a cost-effective solution. So this is Lone Star 6, and some of the design decisions that we were trading off at the point in time that we designed the system. And yeah, there's a fair amount of uphill battle in terms of getting it deployed. Power and cooling are, extremely big challenges, especially in a data center that happens to be as full as the data center that we have right now. Part of the problem is a lot of our systems are cycling through a renewal cycle, and especially when they're large storage systems, we're required to keep the old one up, bring the new one up simultaneously, effectively doubling our footprint to allow a migration period. We would love to have done this with Lone Star 5 and Lone Star 6 that had both up at the same time. That would have been extremely challenging. But ideally, we would have both systems online at the same time and allow a multi-month migration period for users. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the actual detail on what the hardware and the image that you've just seen provides. I'm going to try and fly through this because I don't really like slides. I kind of prefer to be able to explore actively. So I would like to get to the point, hopefully, where we can just start, browsing the system for, what's out there. But in the short term, what you were looking at before is the Dell 6525s. These are the immersion cooled servers. There are 84 chassis with 4 servers per node. So, 336 total servers. It's a pretty decent server count considering if you flick back a slide, the footprint is these 4 tanks that you can see over here. To put that into perspective, I did double tap there. Now it's going to move 3 chunks. And to put that into perspective, we've got a total of 240 6525s. These are the 1U Dell chassis that I showed in the previous system. So there's, and those are distributed across 10 separate and independent racks, of which in the previous image you could see 3. So these disperse all the way over the left-hand side of the data center over here. So yeah, the density is substantially more with the immersion cooled gear. Then we've got 40 7525 chassis, which are the 2U chassis, and essentially the main things to know about these are that these are the GPU enabled nodes. So we've got 2 NVIDIA A100s in each of 16 nodes, and we're experimenting with a new switched PCIe fabric called Giga IO, where we would like to take with the remainder of these servers a selection of the nodes and essentially combine their memory footprints together, and also possibly expose more GPUs to them, allowing us to create a sort of a dynamically scaled, nodes with dynamically scaled memory, or memory that we can sort of manipulate into large memory nodes. And then the final 16 of them are expected usages for persistent software images. So this is sort of also just work in progress. So that's kind of the compute hardware summary. The storage that supports this is mostly a scratch file system. So TACC, our scratch file systems are essentially not quoted, as in you can put as much on them as you like. But the only solution to having non-quoted file systems is to be able to purge the file systems. So we only guarantee data on scratch file systems for 15 days. Now, in reality, we're closer to 90 days on the big flagship systems, but in the short term, you can see we're not full, so we're not anywhere close to purging. this file system, but it is an 8.1 petabyte file system, which is fairly substantial, although not as substantial as some of the stuff you'll hear about in a little bit. And this is made up of a pair of metadata servers that are a failover pair, each with 6, approximately 7 terabyte targets. And then 6 storage servers, each SAS connected to 4 EMC 4084 chassis. So the 84 on the end of these ME 4084s is 84 disks. I believe they're 12 terabyte disks per slot. But again, we can absolutely explore any of this that you would like to in the interim. I see there's a question saying, are there GPU nodes for persistent Jupyter notebooks? Not necessarily, but as the Jupyter notebooks come through, yes, it's entirely possible that we could go that way. Yeah, as of right now, the answer is no, but potentially yes. Why weren't more A100s installed per GPU node of LS6? So we've got a fair selection of other GPU subsystems, and we have actually set it up. As you can see, we're sitting on enough nodes that we can split the GPUs out and go 1 per node, or we could actually increase the density and start moving them up to 4 per node. Really, we're kind of watching other subsystems, other GPU subsystems of the flagship systems. And for the most part, it does seem to be people on average tend to use 1 GPU per node more than all of them. So our ordering at the moment is many people use 1 GPU per node quite successfully, followed by people who use all of the GPUs per node quite successfully, which I guess does lead me to say, why did we do 2 and not more? But this is basically coming through from the Lone Star 5, which also had the same count of GPU nodes, and we never really saw them massively saturated. They only had 1 GPU per node, and they weren't A100s. They were Lone Star 5 was Haswell generation, so they were probably they might have been as bad as K40s. So it's quite an old technology. No, the A100s are not using NVLink to increase parallel activity. They are just straight PCI connected. And we do have the opportunity of adding additional GPUs through JBOFs connected to the GigaIO servers. So we have essentially set it up so that we have as many options as we possibly could have. So essentially, usage patterns will determine mostly how these things end up set up. So the high performance fabric configuration is essentially just the core switch is made up of 16 Mellanox HDR switches. So this is 200 gigabits per second per port. There's 16 of those switches. We're doing a fat tree topology to 20 leaf switches. The QM8790s are 40 port switches. So technically this actually makes our core switch only half populated, which is not quite true because there's still some ports taken by storage, but we're around 50% populated. So there's a potential that the system builds out as we free up some space in the data center. But as of right now, we've taken more or less everything there is. And then leaf switches, the same QM8790 switches, 20 nodes per switch. And the switches, as I mentioned, are 40 port switches. So there's no oversubscription, which is kind of a nice position to be in and a little bit different from some of our other flagship systems. That should mean that for Lone Star, we would get the most consistent MPI performance, and it wouldn't really matter if nodes end up distributed across different racks and you happen to be saturating 200 gigabits per second per port, which if you are achieving that, that's pretty impressive. And because these servers are all PCIe Gen 4, all of the compute nodes are 200 gigabits per second per port as well, which is a little different from some of our other flagship systems. So in terms of software, we've set this up as a fairly standard TACC cluster. So from the sysadmin side, which hopefully not a lot of you are especially interested in, we've got an operating system, a provisioning environment, a change management tool, a selection of fairly important software stack items for managing our parallel file systems, our subnet manager for the high-speed fabric, and our job scheduler, batch scheduler. I'm happy to take questions about any of these things, but this is all my team's realm, and again, hopefully not particularly interested in anyone. One thing I will say is the Rocky decision was pretty, well, rocky, I guess. It's been a challenging moment in sysadmin because the IBM purchase of Red Hat has sort of created challenges in the CentOS space, which is the free equivalent of Red Hat, or the open, it's what OpenSUSE is, the SUSE. So CentOS looked like it wasn't going to be a great option, and a couple of competitors spawned up, and they're very new to the game, and they possibly haven't really provided us the advantages that we were hoping. We probably could have just stayed with CentOS and suffered the consequence. Anyway, that's a long story that I'm getting into, and I'm happy to take questions about that afterwards. But the user-facing side, the main thing for user-facing stuff is still Slurm. So our users are interacting mostly with the batch scheduler to request resources, followed by LMOD, which is our module environment, finding what software is available, and also tying your own software in, setting up your environment correctly, and allowing you to launch jobs as easily as possible. Selection of compilers maintained by our staff, and then an array of TACC software for us to explore. So where am I on time? I'm probably like right on time already, aren't I, Joe?
Yeah, maybe you got a few minutes left if you want to finish up something quickly. Okay,
so this was just essentially an opportunity that I wanted to take to try to, just essentially restate most of what I'm looking at in actual, exploring the system. This is where we are at the moment. We got a selection of queues up. The main one that people are going to care about mostly is the normal queue.
So we just see your PowerPoint still, Nick.
Okay. I forced it to share. How do I change that? Stop share, more. Share screen. Share. Okay. Is that, yep, that's an improvement. Yep. Thanks very much, Joe. Appreciate that. So a selection of queues that are available to users in their summarized form. We've got 150 nodes allocated right now, quite a few idle, a couple that are out. So we're working on some of those. They're in for repair. And most interestingly, sort of the node count totals. Our GPU nodes, again, currently a couple allocated, a couple not allocated. So this is kind of what you can expect to find. This is all Slurm. And then one of the items I left out of the slides was just going into what each of these nodes are. If I request a node, apparently don't have any default set. I'm just going to go to a node then. Okay, so this is what you can expect to find in terms of resources. So the main two that people generally care about are the processors. So you're looking at 128 cores. They're the AMD EPYC 7763 processors. So this is 128 real cores. This is not hyper-threaded cores, which is pretty good node count. It's dual socket. So this is the first socket. They're labeled 0 and 1, and 64 cores per socket. So that's a pretty impressive node. The per core performance is actually slightly lower than Frontera, but obviously the additional cores mean that the actual node performance per node, we're finding it is about 150% of the Frontera nodes. So I keep comparing to Frontera, which is our biggest flagship system and our next most recent cluster that we've deployed. So I suppose that's not helpful. So we're looking at 256 gigs of RAM per node. So this is kind of when you go down the AMD route, you get far better performance if you get the memory balancing right. I can point some people at some white papers on that. Yeah, so 128 cores, 256 gigs of RAM per node. And then our usual set of file systems. So this one actually doesn't have them mounted, so it's clearly a work in progress server. Yes, it is, because it's running CentOS. But our usual file systems, let's see if I can find. I usually like to, if I'm exploring, I usually like to find nodes that I can find, reserved nodes or idle nodes, but I prefer just to pick broken ones. So these guys are waiting for BIOS update, but they should be otherwise complete. Anyway, so here's file systems. So we're looking at the Corel file systems are mounted, the work file system. So if you're familiar with TACC systems, this is a globally shared file system that's available to you. You've got a 1 terabyte quota on this system, and if we're quotering, then the file system will never be purged. And then Scratch file system sitting over here. So that's all stuff that I've already showed in the slides. So yeah, just a little bit of exploration around the back end of the system. I'd be willing to go into anything that people have specifically that are interesting. One of the things I did raise was software. So this is kind of our list of pre-installed software and options that we make available by default. Most of these are built by TACC's HPC staff and deployed on the systems. So that's kind of the list of what's already there. But many users are obviously just creating their own in their own home, in their own space. That's really all I wanted to say about Lone Star 6, but I was hoping that people would hit me up with specifics of things that they actually wanted to see while I'm on the system.
Yeah, Nick, thank you so much for that. I think in the interest of time, there's a few questions maybe that were still in the chat. Maybe you could just answer by text, and then we'll switch it over to Chris to let him get set up to talk about Corel as well. And then if we have time at the end, we can pop back to you here and we can see if anyone has specific questions about things they want to see. But yeah, Chris. Yeah. Thanks, Nick. I'll let Chris go ahead and share his screen too. And I love seeing the mineral oil immersed nodes too. Every time I think about someone working on a node, my imagination goes straight to Augustus Gloop falling in the chocolate river in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I assume that has never happened in our data center yet.
No, that's not going to happen. There's not enough space left over around the oil for you to actually fall into anything. If we ever built a data center that was like a swimming pool and just filled that with servers, then maybe that would be a different scenario. But one thing I will say is just routine repairs and even doing everything we can to keep that stuff under control. There's just weird things like the door handles to the door that's closest to the machine room, and that ends up oily. So, not very, but just enough that you notice it every time. So, it's it is a challenging environment. One of the other things I will say is the specific solution that we purchased, the GRC solution, was is specifically set up to be very self-contained and fairly dense. I think you can see in the image, if I switch back, they really do fit everything into, why are we not going backwards? They really do fit everything into literally just the space that we have. And that means all of our cabling has to fit inside this middle section over here. And that is quite a lot. There's a little space for switches across the front. Typically, GRC's other customers don't see the level of switches because most of their customers aren't running a high-speed fabric. For the high-speed fabric, you're not supposed to put fiber cables into the mineral oil because it degrades the wrappers around the fiber a little bit faster, and they can become very fragile over time. So we're obliged to stick to copper cables. The copper cables for HDR are really thick. And so getting all of that stashed in this little space over here, plus this space over here, well, if I open these panels up, you would see it's very tight. So anyway.
Cool. Let's switch over to Chris while we have him here, and then
okay.
I'll let you keep answering questions in the Zoom chat if you don't mind, Nick. Okay, with that, yeah. So Chris Jordan from the Data Management and Collections Group is going to talk about Corel. So I'll let you introduce yourself and your group.
Okay, you seeing my slides okay?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so I'm Chris Jordan. I lead the Data Management and Collections Group here at TACC. And a large part of that is running this system I'm going to talk about today, Corel. And you know, the other part of my time, aside from operating this system, I have a group of people who work on various development and consulting and metadata oriented kinds of tasks around kind of the formation and long-term management and sharing of the kinds of collections that end up getting hosted on Corel. So in one way or another, most of what I do kind of centers on this system. And I'll give just kind of a quick overview of what it is and what the current version looks like. There we go. So this current system that I'm going to talk about today is the fourth hardware version of what we call Corel, which started around 2009. And we've had data that's been continuously on all four of those systems, and actually even got migrated from various little things that we had sitting around TACC at the time that Corel was originally created. So it is something that I think of as continuous in the sense that if you are a person who stored data on Corel in 2009, you can still get back on that system today and still see all that same data in the same way. Around the second iteration of Corel, we started getting support through this thing called the UT Research Cyber Infrastructure Program, which is a program initiated by UT System, and it's maintained support since that time. And we also, like Lone Star, get some additional support by researchers and research groups with large allocations and large data collections on that system, including some researchers who may have started at UT, built up hundreds of terabytes of data on the system, and then moved on to other institutions, but have chosen to stay on Corel as kind of the basis for their collection storage. So the current system, Corel 4, that I'm talking about today is based on the IBM ESS 5000 series. That's actually Spectrum Scale or GPFS, if you're familiar with either of those product names. This is just the the version of spectrum scale GPFS that is integrated with a specific hardware configuration. It uses an erasure coding model for data protection and a combination of Power 9 and x86 systems for the underlying hardware systems. It's a combination of spinning disk, 16 terabyte spinning disk, and a bunch of NVMe drives that are used primarily for metadata, but also there's a bunch of other functions, journals and log files associated with the erasure code model. And this was kind of an important architectural design point for us with this system, was to have both separate metadata capacity and a large amount of metadata capacity, because one of the things that we observed with Corel 3 in particular was that the number of files in these collections was getting kind of excessively high relative to the space consumption. And so we can support about 8 billion files on the system. In terms of raw capacity, just all of the spinning drives in the system, it's a little bit over 40 petabytes there. Sorry, I put the wrong unit there. And just under 40 petabytes in terms of the usable capacity. And the difference there is just a lot of redundancy. And one of the things about this system in particular that makes it pretty different from other TACC systems that we build for the clusters is that we put extra cost, extra design points, extra capacity into building the overall system for reliability and data integrity, so that we can suffer a large number of hardware or other faults without having interruptions. And these systems are also designed to not have to go through scheduled or unscheduled maintenance very frequently at all. So again, with the previous version of this system, we would on average go more than a year between any kind of scheduled or unscheduled interruption in service. So that's a really important point for us when we design and build these systems. And the way I describe it is it's intended for high value data collections. So things that may have cost a lot to generate, different kinds of sensor data, collections that may have a long lifespan, or some significant shared use value to a shared community of researchers. One example of the kind of data that I'm talking about would be the data coming from the Arecibo Observatory that was recently shut down in Puerto Rico. We did go through an effort working with that team to pull all of the data off of that telescope and off of the systems connected to it, and bring it to TACC, because that's essentially irreplaceable data. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with high value data collections that go on Corel. So, because fundamentally this is just a big file system with a lot of storage. Another way of looking at it is as a suite of services that are oriented around data access and sharing of data. So we have kind of typical SSH, SCP based data transfer mechanisms. We also support grid FTP, which is the underlying mechanism used by Globus. For all of the TACC, HPC, and VM infrastructure, we support NFS access, and we typically will have hundreds of NFS clients active at any given time. We also have kind of simple web publication mechanisms so that you can share your data with anybody over open HTTP access. And then there's a number of kind of more specialized mechanisms for access, including iRODS and S3 are the ones that I called out here. But there are others. Somebody had asked in the chat about TAPIS, and we do support TAPIS, and there are other things that we can support either in a general or a custom format if you need it for a project of kind of sufficient size. So just briefly on availability, the system is available to anybody who can request a TACC allocation. If you're at UT, then you can get up to 5 terabytes without any cost. I mentioned before, the system is partially supported by researchers with large allocations. So if you want more than 5 terabytes, or if you move outside of UT, then you have to pay a per terabyte per year cost for using the system, or for using extra storage within the system. And typically all of the services that I talked about don't have any kind of cost associated with them, but it can depend on, whether it's something that we support generally, or we need to do some kind of special effort to add support for something. And another thing I want to call out here is secure data. So when we first kind of built out Corel, one of the things that we heard the most was that people wanted provision for, specifically HIPAA, but there's a whole kind of category of data that's subject to either some kind of special legislative protection, or just a particular licensing requirement, or something else that means you have to apply special confidentiality to it. And we do now, and have for the past couple of years, had a portion of Corel that's kind of set aside for what we call secure data or protected data. We have a kind of full compliance stack that has mind-numbing detail associated with it. And we go through regular audits to ensure that all of the policies are being followed there. On the Corel specific side, it's kind of just a few very specific technologies that we enable. Encryption at rest is kind of one of the most important ones, but there's other special policies around what kinds of access you're allowed to enable, what kinds of access are allowed to the system at all, and the available services. And again, these secure data allocations, it's kind of just a special category of Corel allocation. It's available to anybody who can request a TACC allocation. But there is some additional documentation required if you want to get one of these. And at the end of the presentation, I linked to the form where we have more information, and you can kind of start that process, because we need to know what kind of data are you storing, what protections need to be applied to it, all of those kinds of things before we can give you an allocation. And I'll skip this one in the interest of time, but we can share the slides later. Just a few things I wanted to highlight that are very large scale making use of Corel. There are over 200 projects on the system right now. And yeah, here are the links that I promised. The Corel user guide has the most kind of detailed information about how to use it, how to get an allocation, all of those kinds of things. And then this protected data service link is where you want to start if you're interested in getting an allocation for data subject to any of those acronyms I mentioned earlier. And I don't know if we have time for a quick question.
Oh, I think you just muted, Chris. But yeah, if there's any questions, please go ahead and post them in chat. Thank you so much, Chris, for that overview. We do have one more to go through. So mine's really quick. I'll just go ahead and I'm gonna stop your screen share, Chris, and share my screen. So I believe you should be seeing my PowerPoint. I only have about 6 slides here. Nick or someone, do you see my slide? I can't actually see the chat.
Yes, your slide is
here. Okay, I'll talk real briefly about Longhorn, and this is the moment where we will cut the YouTube video too, so for future self. So Longhorn is our newer IBM system that's recently been opened up to Texas researchers through an allocation process I'll talk about at the end. But it's comprised of these 108 IBM Power System AC922 nodes, where each node has 2 Power 9 processors with 20 cores each, so 40 processes, 40 cores total. And more importantly, each node also has 4 NVIDIA GPUs, as you can see over here, of these NVIDIA Tesla V100 GPUs. And then similar to Corel, we have this IBM Elastic Storage with 5 petabyte capacity. We've got it in a couple partitions. So we have our Scratch partition on there, as well as our home partition. And then the work file system is also mounted, but Longhorn's actually in another data center on the J.J. Pickle campus. So that work file system mount is over a little bit of a slower network than some of the other machines. And our general guidance, if you're using Longhorn, but much like the other machines as well, is you're going to want to put your data on Scratch and do the compute from there. Okay, moving on. I mentioned we have home, we have Scratch. They are co-located with the compute nodes in that fast spectrum scale file system. They're pretty big. I think Scratch, we have 4 some petabytes. Home, everyone has a 10 to 20 gigabyte allocation, which is similar to our other machines. It's very small, but right now we are actually not purging Scratch because there's so much space available on it, and the users are pretty limited. That's subject to change in the future, but for now, we haven't had to purge anybody's data from Scratch. We have a few users with upwards of 300 terabytes that they're currently using, which is getting a little bit extreme, but for now it's working for us. And then work is the standard network mounted work file system, which everyone has about a terabyte of space on. And I'll just remind that that's over a slightly slower connection. When you're running jobs on Longhorn, we have 3 different queues. We have a very small development queue with 8 nodes, your standard 2-hour max job length. You can submit a job, do it interactively, try and get your code working. We also have this V100 queue. The max nodes per job that we're enforcing right now is 32 nodes per job, which is 128 GPUs in a single job. And we'll provide exceptions to this all the time. So if you need to do more, say you need 64 nodes for a particular reason for a certain job, we have certain windows throughout the year where we're able to accept those large jobs. Or if you need a longer time, like you need to compute for a week instead of 48 hours straight, we can make exceptions, but we evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. Just send us an email, let us know what you're thinking about and what you want to do, and we'll try to figure out a way to work you in. Moving on. So we've also spent a lot of time preparing some Conda environments, because doing machine learning, using AI, doing deep learning on Longhorn is obviously a big use case. And so previously IBM had prepared these Power AI libraries for doing machine learning. I think they're debunked now. I think they've been usurped by something else, but we have most of the latest machine learning packages and APIs available on Longhorn up to the version of Red Hat that we currently have. So we're on Red Hat 7 for this IBM machine. So not the very latest version of all these packages are available, but for the most part, we have the latest version up through Red Hat 7. And as a sidebar, we are planning an upgrade to Red Hat 8 in the near future, so just be aware that that is coming. One more thing I want to mention is there has been some demand for supporting GUI apps, in particular RStudio, Jupyter Notebook, VS Code, and we now do support all of these on Longhorn. You can actually launch VS Code right on a login node if you want to develop your code interactively, and you don't need to submit a job to do that. You can actually just run it right on the login nodes and then connect to it through a DCV session. And what else? RStudio and Jupyter Notebooks, these do both run on compute nodes. And then it's the same sort of max wall clock limit of 48 hours. But what you do is you can either from the command line launch a job, and then you'll get a connection instruction printed out to screen, and then you just connect to it through a browser. Or what you can do is you can go to this TACC analysis portal web interface where you can also launch these jobs, and then you'll just be presented a button to connect directly to them. What else? I think I have one more. So yeah, if you are interested in using Longhorn or even Lone Star 5 or Lone Star 6, those two machines actually are now being allocated through a new process. This called TACCSTER. This documentation, this process, the requirements for it is evolving, and we ourselves are still learning about what is required to request access to these different machines. But it's very similar to the old allocation request process that you might be familiar with Stampede and Lone Star and other previous machines. But just be sure to check out this link below and keep an eye out for this director discretionary allocation submission. You can request Longhorn right through there. And Lone Star 6, I believe, has its own button for requesting allocations. Yeah, other than that, check the user guide, email us for help. We're always happy to work with you on things like queue exceptions, installing software, answering any questions, or just getting started on a project. And with that, I will take any questions at all for Nick or Chris or myself. And I want to thank everybody so much for their attendance too, because I know it's a snow day in many parts of Texas. And UT is actually closed today. So Nick and Chris, you both didn't have to be here, but I greatly appreciate you still doing this webinar with me. And thank you to everybody else for your attention. All right, not seeing any other questions. I think we can end it there safely. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much for organizing, Joe.
Thanks all.